People will often approach me and ask something like they're interested in radical left politics but haven't read anything on the subject and don't know where to start. And so they'll ask me for a recommendation for an easy introduction to leftist literature. I'm always happy to see this sort of question because there's so much misinformation about leftism out there as a result of reactionary rhetoric as well as monopolization of the radical left by Marxist-Leninists over the 20th century. I think it's therefore understandable that a lot of people don't understand the core ideas and arguments of the radical left, and so they think we're just a disorganized bunch of naive idiots, which is probably true, but nonetheless. Lots of people don't have the time to be studying philosophy or politics in detail, and they just want to understand enough to be able to make a decision for themselves as to what they agree with. So I've compiled a very short 3-part and very accessible, non-sectarian reading list that I think will help you to come to make an informed decision about leftism in general. It probably won't allow you to decide specifically which ideology you agree with, but I'm sure the kind people in the comments will be happy to provide some introductory texts for their own ideology. Hopefully, after reading these texts, you'll be able to 1. Understand the basics of the radical left, 2. Be able to sift through the nonsense and misinformation surrounding leftism, and 3. Be able to refute 90% of arguments you'll find people making against the left. The first book I'm going to recommend to you, and in my opinion the only absolutely must-read on this list, is a semi-fiction book written in the early 1900s, I think maybe just before the war, by a guy called Robert Tressel, and it's called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. This book is held up by both Jeremy Corbyn and the heretic Owen Smith, and actually my own father as well, as the definitive book for understanding leftism for the working class. It's practically a Bible to the working class, and pretty much inspired the creation of the Labour Party, back when it still had a point to existing. It's a fiction book which portrays the desperate conditions of workers at the time, but there are also these sections that I call the lecture sections, which break down exactly what it is that capitalism gets wrong into its basics. That is, the separation of who does the labour and who gets the reward. Better still, it's practically written for workers to realise that they're being exploited, so it's extremely accessible. And because it portrays the horrible poverty of working class families at the time, you get something that you won't receive from simply reading Marx or Bakunin. And it's something that a lot of leftists really are lacking in today. That is, empathy for others. I know that sounds flowery, but hear me out. You are not going to persuade anyone whilst you are using language like bourgeois, superstructure, and reactionaries. It just turns people off. If you want to be convincing, you need to have empathy for other people's lack of understanding, and that is what you get from this book. The question at the end of the book that people will bring up is, have things changed? And if you've been paying attention to the core message, you'll conclude, no, there's just an added mask of charity and security. Throughout the whole of the book, the main character is being confronted by the same tired arguments and misinterpretations of socialism that you'll hear liberals and right-wingers use today, including socialism means giving the poor money, socialism is against human nature, capitalism is the best system we have, the problem is actually immigrants, all of it. So this book shows that people in general had not learned a thing about socialism in over 100 years. How? Well, it's repeatedly shown throughout the book that it's largely 2 things: mainstream media and the fact that labour workers are simply too poor and too busy to have the time or schooling to know any better. And the book ends in the exact same way as most attempts to change things do today. Everyone's just dejected and pessimistic, because though they now know what the real problem is, they're politically powerless to change anything. For the second read, you actually need to read 2 books, but they're so connected that you can pretend it's just one. I'm sure you've heard of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the political philosopher, and well, Rousseau is sort of a proto-socialist, and he wrote 2 texts which I think are extremely important for defeating the whole human nature nonsense and the inequality is actually freedom bullshit. And you should read these consecutively to really understand both of them. The first is Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and the second is The Social Contract. They're pretty easy reads, and they do what they say in the title, laying out an argument for why inequality is generally worse for a society than better, and why a person is better off working for everyone and not just their own gain. You might think you understand the social contract and equality arguments made because you've heard basic forms and attempted refutations by right-wingers, but I promise you, you don't. When you're actually reading it, it's a lot more convincing, and it doesn't only talk about how selfishness harms society as a whole, but also psychologically damages subjects. Consequently, people think Rousseau is arguing for fascism and that people give up their freedom to be selfish completely. But this is false and assumes that what is in one person's true interests is mutually exclusive with the interests of a society as a whole, which is completely untrue, Rousseau argues. Rousseau argues it's actually society itself and constructs which corrupt more so than any idea of people being inherently evil in themselves. And even if you disagree with this to an extent, he's still a fantastic and quite convincing read, and his use of dialectics and arguments is really good. Thirdly, I'm going to give you a bit of an either-or. I'm sure you want to have an understanding of the left's economic stances, and you want to be able to refute the nonsense about leftists not understanding economics, which assumes that there's only one branch of economics worth talking about, and in fact you'll find by talking to writers that they themselves have very little understanding of the two economic schools I'm about to recommend introductory books about. These books are the Elgar Companion to Post-Keynesian Economics and the Elgar Companion to Marxian Economics, both of which you can find PDFs of online. Both of these are really good introductory texts to their respective schools, and they're really not boring if you like to learn about new things. Marxian economics is quite self-explanatory. Marxian economists agree with ideas like the labor theory of value based on socially necessary labor time, a different approach to Adam Smith, the tendency of profit rate to fall over time, and all that stuff that right-wingers do misunderstand the meanings of all the time. On the other hand, you might find that it would be weird to hear the words Keynes and radical left put together, but post-Keynesian economics and Keynesian economics are really quite different. Keynesian economics is a branch of what is known as neoclassical economics, and post-Keynesian economics is not, and in fact, there are a lot of prominent post-Keynesian thinkers you would think would be Marxians. To name a few, Rosa Luxemburg, Hyman Minsky, and Mikhail Kalecki. In fact, the term neo-Marxian economist refers to much more of a post-Keynesian than a Marxian. They're basically Marxians who reject the labor theory of value and use the, in my opinion, very relevant idea of accumulation of capital laid out by Luxemburg. And that's because post in this case actually refers to a return to Keynes, because post-Keynesianism posits that a neoclassical synthesis is a misinterpretation of Keynes. And you'll find that post-Keynesian predictions have very often been accurate, and they've contributed quite a lot to economics behind the scenes. The first time I was reading through the Elgar Companion to Post-Keynesian Economics, I was frankly blown away by the brilliance of its common-sense critiques of neoclassical and Austrian economics, some of which I actually used in my recent critique of Austrian economics video. And you can probably tell I've got a bit of a slant towards post-Keynesian economics, and I won't lie about that. But I'm not going to tell you which one to read first. Lastly, I'd just like to offer an optional added choice to the more individualistic of you out there, or those interested in really being able to refute the whole individualism versus collectivism false dichotomy. I really recommend that you read Oscar Wilde's essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. It's very different because it approaches the question of socialism from a purely individualistic perspective, and it's something you need to experience rather than be told about, as with most of Wilde's writings. So I'm not going to tell you anything more about it, but thank you for listening, and I hope I've helped you inspire you to get reading.